The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Dr. David Sinclair, the biologist, inventor, entrepreneur, and author. You are a professor in the Department of Genetics and co-director at the Center for Biology of Aging Research at Harvard Medical School. As one of the preeminent voices in the field of longevity, your work has been featured in 5 books and 2 documentary films, including Morgan Freeman's Through the Wormhole. You've received over 35 awards and are listed in Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People in the World. Your groundbreaking book, Lifespan: Why We Age and Why We Don't Have to, reveals the incredible breakthroughs and emerging technologies that can help all of us live longer, younger, and healthier. David, welcome to London Real.
Brian, thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
Great to be here too. You know, I want to kick it off with a quote from you where you say, aging is a disease and that disease is treatable. When you tell people that for the first time, how often do you get these perplexed looks? Or are people becoming more hip to this concept that maybe we're not destined to just grow old fast?
Well, about 10 years ago when I said that for the first time, a lot of people were shocked. The problem is that we are raised to think that aging is something separate from diseases and that aging is natural, whereas diseases are not. But it's actually, it turns out aging is the cause of most of the diseases that we get, the root cause, 80% of the causes of cancer and heart disease and Alzheimer's. And once you explain that, as I've been doing for now at least over a decade, very publicly, more and more people are realizing that the current way we do medicine, which is to treat the end result of aging, is not as effective as what we're trying to do, and that is to slow down and reverse the aging process. But it is a psychological mind warp when people first hear it, that aging is a disease. And sometimes it's insulting to people. I don't have a disease, I'm healthy. But the truth is that we age from conception. We're all aging every day and we can measure that now. But the good news is that it's increasingly preventable and treatable.
And certain countries kind of age faster than other countries, right? And I know in your book, you kind of talk about like Russia versus Israel versus America, and they tend to rack up the years, you know, sooner than later. Which kind of like top G20 countries are better or worse than others? And why typically is that?
Well, it's mostly lifestyle. We're all very similar genetically as a species. There are some good genes. The Japanese in general have some pretty good genes, longevity genes. But across humanity, there are lots of genes that people have. The difference that actually we've noticed is that about 80 to 90% of longevity and health into our 80s, 90s, and beyond is due to how we live our lives across the planet. And there are certain cultures that, for historical reasons mainly, have the type of lifestyles that turn on the body's defenses against aging. Now, we all know that if we exercise and move and eat less often and focus on plants, that tends to be associated with longer life, as well as lower stress and more sociable communities. These are all things that make us live longer. And there are pockets of that around the world. There's areas of Greece and Japan, US, Australia. These are countries that tend to have a healthier diet, more community, exercise more, partially because of the climate, partially maybe because they're working on farms. But generally, it's all about lifestyle. And one of the things I've been trying to do, besides my medical research and developing medicines to help people is to say, all right, the medicines are coming, the pills are coming. Until then, we need to stay alive for longer. And how do you do that? It's make sure we at least try to mimic those cultures and get our bodies to fight aging rather than just deteriorate, which is what a lot of modern society is built on. Brian, one of the problems with the world that we have now, particularly in the West and even worse in UK and the US, is that we like to be comfortable. And the markets have given us a very comfortable life, those of us who can afford it. And the problem is that switches off our body's defenses against aging. Not exercising, don't eat well, always being satisfied with the amount of food we have, never being hungry. That's the worst you can have because our aging rate just accelerates with that kind of lifestyle.
Do most people look at you funny when you say, if you can be kind of starving, if you can be out of breath, if you can be cold, then you're going to live this long life? And people are probably looking at you and saying, well, 100 years ago, my grandparents were doing the same thing, or my great grandparents, and they didn't live very long. Is it hard to get people's brain around that?
Well, it does appear to be a contradiction until you really dig in and find out that, yes, eating less often was good for you, and being cold can be good for you, and being hot, and not having as much food, being thinner, is generally good for you to a point. The problem with our great grandparents and even grandparents was that then they were not doing it in a way that was conducive to longevity, in the sense that they didn't get the right nutrition, and they were also plagued by infections. And you look at the risks from 100 years ago. Childbirth was killing people, cancer was killing people, heart disease was rife because of the type of food, a lot of fat people were eating. But if you combine the adversity, or at least mimicking adversity, that they had in their lives with adequate nutrition and modern medicine, that is what we believe gives you the longest life. And the important thing is, it's, a lot of these adversities don't have to be extreme. They can be a little bit of what doesn't kill you, makes you stronger and longer lived. We call this process hormesis. And really, it's not about feeling like you're going to die or that you're going to starve. It's about giving your body a few of those hints, a little bit of exercise, even just 5-10 minutes a day, a little bit of hunger, skip a meal each day and substitute with tea and coffee. These are the things that actually, over the long run, build up to give you maybe an extra 10, even 20 years of extra life.
David, I got to ask you a question. We're seeing these days, they're like, these real quests and cravings by parts of humanity for these extreme lifestyles. I've had Wim Hof on the show, who jumps in the ice baths and has the breathing. I've had David Goggins on here, who does these ultra marathons. And, we see people celebrating these extremes in life. I mean, do you think there's something deep down inside of us that is trying to tell us that we need to kind of push the limits of humanity, while we're also trying to sit in business class and, drive in the Range Rover and all that stuff? Have you ever thought about that?
For sure. We as humans, we're not built for a comfortable lifestyle. Our bodies just fall apart if we give them too much of a good time. I call that the abundance mode. And I mentioned earlier the adversity mode. You've got to cycle between the two, because one is the abundance mode is build and repair, but the adversity is hunker down and survive. And if you don't have both of those, then you're just not going to slow down aging and live long. And I think there is an inbuilt desire for many of us to get back into more of that adversity mode. We feel better, we have more energy, we think better. And that's because what happens when you're in this adversity mode, at least for part of the day or part of the week, is that our bodies turn on these survival genes, some of which I study in my lab, called sirtuins. Without those, we become lethargic, and our bodies have a much less metabolic activity, much less mental acuity. We put on weight, we don't feel as good. So I think what Wim Hof, Dave Goggins, and others, what they're trying to do is get back to our evolutionary roots, where we spend at least part of the day turning on these survival genes that made us feel better, work better, live better, and even think better. And I also, what they often tell us is that if we live these lifestyles we also psychologically feel better. We feel better about ourselves, but also the hormones and the molecules that are released in the brain make us more optimistic, make us happier, make us more alive. And that's also what I think drives those guys or those people and many of us to give some adversity have some adversity during the day.
And look, I want to jump into a lot of the ideas you have around diet, around exercise and cold and et cetera. But maybe quickly to look at what's actually happening with the genes, because I think you've said that only 20% of our longevity is genetically determined. You talk about this concept of epigenetics and how we might have one set of genes, but actually getting those, I guess, copied over for new cells or getting those being able to be read efficiently or correctly is the problem we have as we age. And I think one of your old TED Talks, you really date yourself, is you talk about scratches in a CD, where, again, I'm dating myself because I know what a CD is. But maybe you can talk to people a little bit about how we can all start with the same DNA, but some people by the time they're 50 are actually replicating kind of more errored cells.
Yeah. So this is what I call the information theory of aging. Now, the old idea is that we just deteriorate, we get damaged cells, and we eventually die. The new idea is that we're more like computers, where we have software, and the software determines the function of the body. And because every cell has the same DNA, but different functions, each cell has to have a different type of software so that a brain cell works differently than a skin cell. And these software programs are written down as we're in the womb and then born. Over time, what we've discovered in my lab and others around the world is that what probably is a main driver of the aging process is that the software of cells gets corrupted, so that cells, even though they have the original hardware, the DNA, to function, the software that reads the DNA breaks down. And what we see, we have this big paper coming out in the scientific literature soon that actually is very good evidence that this is true, because we can take a mouse and we can corrupt the software and we can get it to age more rapidly, twice as fast. And then we've discovered there's a backup copy of the original software that we can reboot the system, and we can get that mouse to de-age, to reverse its aging process and become young again. We used this a couple of years ago, to reset the age of the eyeball in mice and get them to go from being blind in old age to being able to see again. And so it's very exciting that our bodies have this software that can be rebooted and reestablish youth in the same way that you might polish scratches off a CD to be able to play that music again. And what this actually means is that we're not just falling apart, we actually have the instructions to be young again. And now when I look at someone who's elderly, who's frail, who can barely walk, who might even still be bedridden, I look at that person as still being young. Their body just doesn't know how to read that youthful information. But one day it'll be possible, I'm certain, that we can give someone who's elderly a pill for, say, a couple of months and reverse their aging process so that they literally don't just feel young, they do become young again.
My grandparents were, farmers and cattlemen and cattlewomen in Arizona. And they grew up with these kind of hard working lives. But, they also, my grandpa and grandma, they kind of died of heart disease because they didn't really understand their diet. Of course, everybody was probably overeating then and over drinking and over smoking. I know you grew up near the outback, and you had a grandmother really that kind of brought you up, but also she aged, pretty rapidly. And I'm wondering, like you said, you look at older people today, and I'm wondering if you look at them and you're just thinking, wow, man, if I had been able to educate you 40 years ago, you could be thriving now as opposed to be in a nursing home. And I wonder if you ever think about that, even from your own grandmother and your own mother. And I guess that's why you're working on having these supplements to reverse that process.
Yeah, well, I don't sell supplements, but I do work on medicines, and I do try to educate everybody on the planet as best I can reach them, to tell them that it's possible to live at least 15 years longer, I believe 25 years, 30 years longer, just by changing your lifestyle. And the earlier you start, the better. In your 20s, you can start this. And I do wish that I could have educated my grandmother and my mother, who both died fairly young, and or at least became sick young. My mother developed lung cancer in her 50s, and my grandmother became frail in her 70s. And the kind of lifestyle we're talking about is not that difficult. We can get into the details in a minute. But the point is that with education, you can make a massive difference. If you don't smoke, you don't become obese, you get enough sleep, you focus on plants, you don't overeat, you eat less often, skip a meal or two a day, a large meal that is. These things are enough. It's been shown scientifically by looking at tens of thousands of people very clearly. You can extend your lifespan by 15 years just by doing those simple things that most people know about already. Now, the kind of things that I add to are nuances on that, as well as, again, molecules and medicines that some are available right now. I believe we can take that 15 years and make it 25, 30. My father is a good example of someone who did get educated early on and took my advice. He's a scientist, he listens and can make his own judgments. He's now 83 years old. He has no diseases, no aches, no pains, and he's just as healthy, if not healthier than he was in his 30s. He's stronger than me. I'm 53. And he's just loving life, and he's looking forward to another 20, 30 years to go. And when he was in his 60s, he thought that he'd probably be dead by 75, 80, which is the typical life course of a male who lives in Australia. But he's had to just change his attitude because he's just going on and on and on. And he's watching not only his wife, who died young, his peers, who are now, many of them, half of them at least, are dead now because they didn't do the right things.
It's fascinating. You know, David, I get the benefit of talking to a lot of fascinating people on my show, and I've started to notice a lot of them in their mid-70s that are absolutely crushing it right now. You know, people like Graham Hancock was just here in my studio on Friday, Netflix series 72, Robert Kiyosaki, Rich Dad Poor Dad, he's like 75. You know, Dan Pena, the $1 trillion man with a castle up in Scotland, 77. Jim Rickards, you know, all these people. My mom is crushing it pretty good in her mid-70s. And, you know, they've done the right thing. And it's almost, David, like they're in their prime. You know, another 20 years of this, they could add more to the world than the previous 70 years of their life. It's like they've got their IP dialed in. They got their audiences. They've got everything going. And in the past, they might have a few more years left, and then whatever, they would break their hip or they would start to get senile, and then we wouldn't hear from them again. And I'm just imagining what a great world this would be if they could keep cranking that into their 90s. It would be an asset. And I guess this is the question you get a lot is, aren't all of these old people going to be a liability to society? Or can they be assets?
Oh, they can certainly be assets. When you look at my father, he's helping raise the grandkids. He's contributing to the community. He just recently retired after he started up a new career in his 70s. This is going to be the future where someone who's in their 70s and 80s is still considered someone who's very hireable, who has a lot of wisdom, who can educate the young people. We have to change our attitude to someone who's 70 and 80. You can be starting a new career in your 80s now, and that's a normal thing. And we shouldn't look at our parents and our grandparents as guides to how our lives are going to be. Every year that we stay alive, we get another 3 months of life. And that's not even with these age reversal technologies that are just around the corner. So what I think is that it's going to be normal to be in your 90s and still playing tennis with your grandkids and working actively like the people you mentioned. It's going to be increasingly common. Now, if we look at the previous generations, let's take the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth. People in her generation, only 2% of them made it to 100. Children and kids in their 20s today, half of them are going to make it to 100.
Half.
And that's just if you draw a straight line. I think we're going to have an exponential increase in longevity given the technologies that have just been discovered. So at least half. I think it could be the majority of people in their 20s today are going to be healthy into their hundreds.
And you just said for every year you live, you get an extra 3 months of life. You just said that real quickly. What do you mean by that?
Well, we're just extrapolating over historical trends. And it's really a straight line over the last 150 years. The increase in longevity because of medicine, technology, improvements in nutrition are guaranteeing us extra 3 months of life if you stay alive for another year.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.